My name is Mary Ruth Leftwich. I'm the Director of Learning at the Senator John Heinz History Center. We're glad that you have joined us this afternoon for a program that is going to chart the progress of a topic that we've loved and a story we've loved talking about in the History Center, which is Nellie Bly. You are going to be joined by a group of wonderful panelists that are going to share with you information about how this project has come to be, some of the exciting research that's come out, and how you can continue to join us as this story develops as we share it. A few notes today in terms of Zoom. We are in a webinar setting, and what that means is that you can contact us via chat or the Q&A box. There will be a time for questions and answers at the end. So we ask that you put those in the Q&A. That just allows us to make sure that we get any questions addressed so they don't get lost in the chat function. Those tools are at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the chat looks like a speech bubble. Q&A has 2 speech bubbles. If you do want to chat, tell us a little bit about why you're here today, join in conversation. Just make sure that you are using the pull down that says to all panelists and attendees. That means that everyone in our webinar this afternoon will have a chance to see your comments. And we will be posting links as we go as well. And we have been graciously, thanks to the Trees Foundation, given funds to allow for captioning for all of our programs. So you can use the closed caption at the bottom of your screen and click on that if that is a service that you need. Everything will be captioned as well today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ann Madarasz, our Chief Curator and Historian, to introduce the program. Welcome, Ann.
Thanks, Mary Ruth. It's so great to be with everyone this afternoon. This is a subject matter that I've been interested in for a long time, and that I've found that a lot of people in the larger community were interested in. People are always, when you say the name Nellie Bly, it seems that people know and remember Nellie Bly, that she has some staying power. So when I was approached in August by Dr. Alex Taylor at the University of Pittsburgh, he had reached out to a colleague of mine who had hosted his interns in the past about doing an internship. It seemed like this perfect opportunity fell in our lap. This year, of course, we have commemorated the passage of the 19th Amendment, and we have done a year focused around programming related to women forging the way. And it seemed like it was a good time to talk about Nellie Bly in a bigger way. Knowing that there was audience interest in this subject, knowing that we had a good research project, knowing that there was a great story here, knowing that we were getting ready to launch a figure at the airport that's coming soon of Nellie Bly, the world traveler, seemed like the right time to follow her on her journey around the world. And I'm going to invite our first panelist, Lawson Pace, who is that Pitt intern who's done the bulk of the work for this project, to introduce himself and talk a little bit about what interested him in doing this internship and doing this project with us. Lawson.
Thank you. Like Ann said, my name is Lawson Pace. I'm a senior at the University of Pittsburgh with a major in history and minors in museum studies and the Turkish language. This internship for me is fulfilling a requirement for the museum studies minor. But when I first went to talk to Dr. Taylor about putting together an internship and thinking about what made sense for me, something in the realm of history made a lot of sense, for my career goals. And I think ultimately this opportunity was pretty much perfect for me because I do a lot of work as far as my historical research and historical work in the late 19th century. And so when I heard about this kind of Nellie Bly opportunity, I actually, Ann said that we all kind of know who Nellie Bly is, but I had actually maybe heard the name, but I didn't know exactly who she was. But, having done a lot of research in that kind of era, once I really started to do the research, I really was able to engage really closely with the that kind of historical era, based on my background. And, so as far as what interested me, I would definitely say with Nellie in particular, kind of the global aspect to her journey, I think is really important. And also how many different subjects that her story and her journey kind of interacts with, in terms of global history and women's history and all these different kinds of things. So I would say, that's kind of what interested me in this project.
Thanks, Lawson. Let me invite my colleagues, Rhoda and Sarah Reck from the History Center, to each introduce themselves in turn and to talk a little bit about what role they've played in the project. Nate?
Hi, I'm Nate Rodda. I'm the Youth and Family Program Manager at the History Center. So my work is situated in the learning team. So we do all of the public programming, all of the school programming, early learners, everything along those lines. That's kind of our job within the museum. So my job for this particular project is to think about some of the different audiences that connect with this great story. We've been telling Nellie's story through school tours, but we were looking for opportunities to talk about her in a more complete way and for different audiences. So that's been kind of my focus for the project. And we can talk a little bit about the specifics as this conversation goes on.
Great. Sarah?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Sarah Reck. I'm the Senior Digital Marketing Manager here at the Heinz History Center. So my role is within the communications and marketing team, and I touch all of our digital aspect, public-facing digital aspects, so including all of our social media. So my role in this project has been to take, Lawson's great research and great writing and find the best way to, share it publicly. So that's, using our website and using our social media. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this with regards to audience and kind of the ways that we're sharing the story. But that was definitely one of the interesting conversations that we had. And one of the challenges is to find, the best avenues to share the story, especially now that we get to do it virtually and that most of our audiences are online.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So just like Nellie took a journey around the world, we kind of took a journey in developing this project. At the very beginning, my thought was we could launch the project. Lawson was going to do his internship for the fall. It started in August and it'll run till December. We're almost finished prepping all the materials that you'll see rolling out over the coming months. My thought was we could launch Nellie's journey in this project on November 14th when she launched herself on her journey. And then we would follow her day to day as she traveled around the world. So Lawson, talk a little bit about in the very beginning, when you and I were just kind of finding our way, how did you prepare yourself? What were you looking at? What primary sources to think about what kind of material we could generate and how we could tell this story?
Yeah, I think that at least for me, when I'm doing research in general, I think the best approach is often to kind of throw yourself into it. And so a lot of the stuff that I was doing initially was kind of getting straight into some of these primary sources. So, reading the original newspaper accounts, reading her book, things like that. That's the stuff that I really started out with, because when you do that, when you start kind of from the bottom up, you start to understand, it gives you, I think it gives you a more complex understanding of kind of the top down context, right? So that's what I started with. And then as I kind of broadened, started reading some of the secondary works that have been written on Nellie and on her journey. And when we got started with this project, I think that what it was going to completely look like certainly wasn't completely in view. And so there was an ongoing process of developing the format, and the tone and the themes was also a really important thing. And I think that's one of the things that the research really shaped more than anything is the themes that eventually have made their way into this final product. because when you do this research, as I did and have continued to do for these last few months, there are certain themes, certain ideas that kind of crop up again and again. And so these are things that we'll talk about a little later. But that's just to say that that initial research process, it played a really large role in shaping what this eventually came to look like. So
one of the great things about Nellie Bly is she did leave excellent written record. I was particularly captivated when I started looking at her life with the things she wrote early on in her newspaper career, and how as a young woman she was, especially for someone in that period, very much open to critiquing society, asking hard questions, moving in realms where female journalists and women in general might not always have been welcome or comfortable. Lawson, you're reading her newspaper accounts, you're also reading her writing. I hadn't read her Journey Around the World book. I had read her 10 Days in a Madhouse before. How did you find her work and her writing when you first started to encounter it?
I think that it's very easy to get into. You think about 1889, 1890, that was a long time ago, right? But the way that she wrote was very, very accessible. And so that made the research a lot easier, to be honest, because it's made for a popular audience, and she has this style of writing that really, I think, brings out her personality very much so. And so the things that you were just talking about, Anne, her bravery and her assertiveness and all these kinds of different things, and especially her humor, and we've talked about this before, all these things really, really come out in the way that she writes. And just to kind of signpost something that we'll be talking, I think, a little bit more about later, when you compare her account of her journey to the account produced by her competitor, Elizabeth Byland, there's kind of a great study in the contrast of their two personalities, even in the way that they told that story, and because they have a very similar story in some ways, but the way they tell it is very different. So,
yeah. Nate, since you mentioned that you do Nellie Bly programming with school kids, and I know you've done some middle school audience, you've got some book programs and things planned. How do kids relate to her? What do they find appealing, intriguing? Do you use her actual words when you work with them? Talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, Nellie's story is super fascinating. We've been including her in school tours for about 10 years or so, since our Pittsburgh Tradition of Innovation exhibit was redone. And part of her story was included in the exhibit. But there's so many different audiences that love her story. One of the first times that we really, in our modern incarnation of the learning team, that we really dove into her story was in March 2016. We did an early learning program for 2 to 5 year olds and their caregivers. And one of the 3 people that we talked about was Nellie Bly. For that day, we really focused on some of the vehicles, since that's a pretty common thing to talk about with young kids. So all of the different forms of transportation that she used are really interesting and fascinating for kids. Nellie is also one of our regulars for Night at the History Museum, which is our overnight program for Scouts. So we have elementary school Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts who were fascinated by how she went undercover in the 10 Days in the Madhouse story, and how she stood up for herself and her early writing, and that she didn't care if she got in trouble for reporting on, for example, the factory conditions in Pittsburgh. So the factories were funding the newspapers, right? Obviously, they didn't like Nellie writing about that topic. So she kind of got shunted off to the side to write about gardening and more traditional things that women would write about. So there's so many different layers of her story that whole range of audiences love. So for some of the summer camps that we do, to help commemorate Nellie's story, her newspaper created a board game. So we had that board game reproduced, and kids love to play that as we're kind of getting warmed up for the day. So there's just so many different ways that kids and families have interacted with her story over the years, and it's just so layered and so rich, and it goes in so many different directions.
Sarah, that must be one of the reasons she works in the digital. Obviously, this whole project is a virtual project. It's all existing within our digital space. So I imagine it helps when you've got a character who's got these different layers or sides to her personality to be able to parse her out for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what we do from a digital aspect here at the History Center is to tell the stories of people in Western Pennsylvania. And so with someone like Nellie Bly, who, wrote them down, wrote her stories down, including this one or the Madhouse one, it's very easy to then be able to look at her life and bring her words to life, kind of in the digital sphere. In particular, what we were interested in doing here, which I think works really well, is on Twitter. For those of you familiar with Twitter's, I don't want to use the word fleeting because it's weird right now with Twitter's new, some of their new components, but Twitter does go quickly, right? It goes day by day, it goes minute by minute, second by second. And so we were able to take kind of this whole story on a day by day approach and tell it kind of in real time in a lot of ways with that social media platform. So it was good to be able to see, what Lawson has done with pooling each day and each, week and what was important in each of those areas during Nellie's trip, and be able to adapt it then to an audience on social media with photos, with her own words, with just like an overarching story about her whole trip. So I think it adapts really well, especially today. With taking, all of these aspects of it and putting it into a new format and a new digital format. And then one other thing is just with our website, we have the opportunity with all of Lawson's posts about Nellie and kind of summarizing her trip and talking about her trip and all of the pieces around it, to kind of put together a really great landing page on our website that's going to house everything and really tie back to Nellie's story and give the whole thing, in one reading. Come back in January and you'll be able to read it from start to finish. But right now we are doing it kind of each of the days that we're highlighting, day of. So you can definitely follow her in real time, which I think is something that you wouldn't have necessarily been able to do, 130 years ago with the way, her even taking how much time to write it or sending letters and everything like that. And we can just post it in a few seconds.
That had to be one of the challenges, Lawson, because if you read her book, she doesn't necessarily say, day 2, still at sea, or she doesn't always give you those key dates. So you really had to do a little bit of detective work to lay out the calendar in the beginning, didn't you?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As we were trying to hone in on kind of these key dates, what we were going to focus on with these posts, I had to, kind of do a lot of legwork in some places, to kind of triangulate, what days she went where. Because in some places it isn't clear. In some places there are, she actually has like a little itinerary at the end of the book, which kind of helps because it gives you something to work off of, but that doesn't cover everything. And so actually one of the things that I most enjoyed doing in this project is some of the newspaper work I did for the last legs of her journey as she traveled across America by rail, because the American press adored Nellie Bly, and so her every movement was captured. And so there's like kind of by the hour, by the minute coverage of when was she in this town, when was she in this town. And so that's actually one of the easiest parts, even though I had to do a little bit of legwork to find it in these newspapers. but you can know exactly when she was going through Modesto, California, or Chicago, Illinois, or one of these places. But that kind of brings me to kind of the converse of that, is that in America, she received a lot of attention from the press. Overseas, not so much, and the distance made it even difficult to get regular updates back home. And so you kind of, as I was doing this research, she spends so much time so far away from home, and you just kind of have to trust her word on what happens, because there's not a lot of extra primary material. So as far as putting together those dates, it ended up being not as hard, I think, as I thought it was going to be, because there is some of that built into her story already. But it was definitely a process, and sometimes you have to judge based on just certain aspects of the wording in her story. Was this the morning of one day, or was this the start of another day? And there's sometimes things will conflict or what have you. But that's actually one of my favorite parts of doing this project, was kind of pulling out all the different threads with that.
So that became one of our challenges, really, as you talk about this calendar. Is in the beginning, I thought we would cover 75 days, or 72 days of travel and the kind of landing and the kickoff. But it turned out that was probably a little more than the public was thirsty for. So Sarah, Nate, Lawson, talk about how we came to kind of pick the calendar and decide what days we really were going to focus on.
Yeah, I can kind of start with that. I know that there are a lot, if you're very, around on social media, you might see that like NASA does like an Apollo 11 every year, minute by minute kind of recap of the entire mission on Twitter. I know that there's a Titanic one as well that's out there. And so at the beginning, we were kind of putting out the idea of doing something that was much more in depth to Nellie, and with Twitter, maybe even a new account, something like that. But one of the things that I work on a lot at the History Center is reaching the audience we already have and then expanding that audience. And so, one of the cons of starting a new Twitter account is starting from scratch, right? Starting from the beginning. And so what we really were looking to do, at least from my perspective and the digital social media perspective, was to tap into the audience that we already have, all of you on the call, people who already follow the History Center on social media, who already visit our webpage, our website, and kind of give you guys all the story in a way that you're already familiar with finding us and finding out that story. And once we do that, obviously we're hoping that people will pick up on it and share it, and keep reading and following our account to see where Nellie is as we go through this calendar. So instead of going the day by day approach, we did decide to, with Lawson's help, figure out those days that, kind of covered a lot of the story or important moments throughout the story, and pull those out so that we could focus on those instead of, grappling for something to hit every day.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can add on to that. Definitely, as I've said, this was an evolving process of figuring that out. And so I have to admit, it was a little bit of a relief to find out I didn't have to write 72 days worth of content. But I think beyond that, it really kind of came out that you don't necessarily need 72 days, because to be honest, a lot of it would be, oh, she's on the ship. The ship is still going, So I think that setting a limit as to the days, and finally setting on that number of kind of posts or days that we ultimately wanted to focus on was a big help in kind of refining the approach that we're going to take to these days. Because then you start to think about how do we connect these events that are happening because sometimes a post for one day will also include events from previous days. And so you have to think about how that all fits together. But yeah, it was, at least for me, that process of figuring out which dates those were going to be ended up not being as hard as I thought it was going to be, because you have to balance. You don't want to have a bunch of days back to back and then a bunch of days where there's nothing. So the main thing was making sure that we have at least kind of semi-regular dates with interesting stories to tell. And I think there's plenty of that to go around in her story. So
Yeah, I do think that's one of the things that emerged. Nate and Lawson and I would talk at least once a week and sometimes twice a week. And Sarah would pop in every couple of weeks just to keep us on task. And so we were thinking about the final product as well as the evolving product. And one of the interesting things that began to emerge in our conversations is we began to think about not just Nellie Bly, but Nellie Bly's world. And what was her perspective? What are some of the bigger issues she is interacting with? And what were different ways to tell it? And, Lawson's already mentioned, she had a competitor. So who was her competitor in this race around the world? And what was her life like? Who was she? But as some of the other issues, talking about colonialism in the British Empire, talking about this kind of global technology of transportation that made Nellie's journey possible, talking about literature and Jules Verne, who inspired her. So some of these themes that we landed on that, Nellie kind of opened the door to, but which took it away from just condensing her book and sharing that, in a way that anybody could read. I invite the panelists to kind of talk about some of that focus and how it affected the final product.
Yeah, so I really appreciated the context that we've tried to put Nellie Bly in. It's made it, I think, a more complete story, and it's definitely opened up some programming activities or some ideas, which is kind of my main role in this. So I'm really interested in the connections to the Jules Verne story. So that's one thing that specifically gets called out in her book, is her meeting with Jules Verne. I've been interested in Jules Verne for a while. Whenever I was in college, I studied abroad in Nantes, France, which was his hometown. So one of our little field trips was going to a house that was kind of like a house museum near where he grew up. So it was cool to connect with that in a different way. And I reread Around the World in 80 Days for the first time in a long time as part of this project, to try to understand the inspiration for Nellie's journey. So we decided to go ahead and make that be a family book club session that we're going to have later on in January that'll help commemorate Nellie's return to New York City. So that was a really interesting connection, is taking her inspiration and then working with the source material and then turning it into a program. So that's really cool, and I'm really looking forward to that program in January.
yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that as well. I think that talking about putting Nellie Bly in context is so much of what we've tried to do, because that's sort of the big question when you're putting together something like this is, why should people read this and not just go read the book, right? And I think that especially as you get into some of that, as she meets with Jules Verne and as she travels through these parts of Asia, you really kind of you really have to engage with these topics that may not really be explained in her account, because although she does write very clearly and very accessibly, there's things that just don't necessarily make sense, from a 21st century viewpoint, or that you're not really, that just require kind of extra unpacking. And so that's certainly one of the things that we've tried to do, is try to pull out the things from kind of that context that that add to the story, and that kind of that put her within the time that she lived, and try to engage with some of those issues.
So the calendar was one of the things we had to resolve with Nellie. Nellie's perspective on the world was another one of the things we had to kind of discuss and resolve. You know, some of the things Nellie had to say about the places she traveled, the people that she met, would be considered at best offensive now, and in some sense were, you know, racist stereotypes from the period. So it's something we talked about. Could the panelists kind of touch on how we address this and how we share what lens we want to see Nellie and the way she saw the world through?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that kind of came up as I was reading some of these primary sources, and especially her primary account, is that, you know, this actually kind of came up accidentally at first, because I include quotes from Nellie Bly in these posts that we're coming out with, and Anne just kind of flagged something that I had included in there that was, it was a quote. I think it was from Singapore or something like that. But Anne kind of flagged that for me, and she pointed out kind of the use of, what we would consider now to be offensive language in there, and so that kind of got us thinking about how do we address that? How do we engage with that? Because you really do have to engage with it, because one of the kind of narrative threads that we really started to touch on more and more was the fact that the very existence of Nellie Bly's journey around the world was kind of a product of this shrinking of the world that was brought on by British colonialism and British imperialism, which is sort of the premise of the original book, Around the World in 80 Days, that these advances in infrastructure and things of that nature that are being created by British imperialism are allowing these kinds of journeys to be made. And so it's certainly something that we've had to engage with as we kind of go through this.
And I think thinking about Nellie, like more complete context, kind of makes her like a really complicated character, a complicated historical figure. Whenever you think about her like mental health advocacy, right, she seems like pretty progressive and like advocating to improve conditions. But whenever you read some of her like descriptions of people, especially in Asia, it's very stereotypical, and it's very Eurocentric and kind of disparaging. So for me, she's just like a really fascinating character who like tries to improve conditions for including immigrants who came to the United States, but then also like being really like disparaging about people in their home countries.
And I think, as Nate said and Lawson both, we didn't want to ignore this with our audience. Nellie Bly is a complicated character. She has a appealing personality. I think she writes in a way that is humorous, as Lawson said, but she is very much a product of that period and of these viewpoints. And we wanted to allow our visitors to learn from that. So we made the decision that we were going to actually say to our visitors up front that instead of trying to ignore this language, instead of trying to work around this language or not engage with it, we wanted to say up front that this is a primary source, this is a historical source, and we want to engage and learn from this time period and from this person from the past. Her character strengths and her flaws or weaknesses. So we put a statement, worked through the History Center staff and shared with the professional staff a variety of ways of how do we engage with this and how do we let our readers and our visitors know that we're aware of this part of the story and of the part of these historical documents. So if you visit the webpage, you will see a statement that we arrived at after looking at a number of examples from other institutions like the Library of Congress, even from Disney, and how they talk to their visitors and their audience about these kinds of issues, and put that onto the site. And Sarah, is this?
Sorry, Anne, we lost you there for a second. What were you going to ask me?
I was going to say, is this the first time we've done something like that with one of our web pages?
Yeah,
acknowledge this about a historical character.
Yeah, as far as I know, I've been with the History Center now for 6.5 years. This is the first time that we've, drafted something that was, so direct and so, to point out the fact that we are acknowledging this, which I think is good, and I think it says a lot about, the way that history evolves and the way that even teaching history has evolved. And I think from a digital perspective, it's really important to acknowledge that. Social media is so quick. It's you can, on Twitter in particular, you have 280 characters. You can't always tell every nuance of every story on social media, and so the opportunity to reflect on what we need to discuss and the the challenges around the language she used and the stereotypes that she pointed out, whether knowingly or not, is very important, I think, to not only to us as historians, but also to the audiences who are learning about Nellie and learning more about her and her journey.
I see in the chat a couple of people have been asking, are we going to talk more about Nellie Bly? So why don't we just take a little bit of time to talk about her story? Lawson, if you want to give us a little brief biograph of who she was. I know some of this is in the very first post you wrote. It was just an introduction to her. And then maybe talk about what it is that, if there are other things that you particularly learned from her or learned from her life that we haven't touched on.
Yeah. So the thing that I was thinking about, when you summarize her life, you kind of have to start with that she is a Western Pennsylvanian, especially, being the Heinz History Center and coming at it from kind of this Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania history perspective. That's what it all comes back to. So she was born in 1864 in Cochran's Mills, Pennsylvania. And her birth name was Elizabeth Cochran. And so that town was actually named after her father, who operated the mills there. And ultimately, it was the death of her father that kind of sent her along this path to where she eventually ended up in journalism after she had to move with her family to Pittsburgh. And from there, she wrote a letter in response to an editorial in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and her letter was noticed by the editor of the Dispatch, and so that's where she sort of began her career in journalism. And I think one of the really interesting things that kind of comes out of that when we talk about Nellie's early life is that she was not especially educated, which is amazing when you consider all the things that she went on to do. She started at Indiana. She started to take teaching classes at Indiana Normal School, which is now Indiana University of Pennsylvania. But she had to drop out because the family didn't have the money. And so ultimately, that original letter to the Pittsburgh Dispatch was not particularly well written at all. There were grammar issues, spelling issues, things of that nature. But she had the potential. And so the editor really saw that in her. And I think that she saw her own potential. And that's another big thing, kind of as we go through her life, is that she was never afraid to stand up for what she thought was right. And actually, one of the things, I guess this is giving away the plot a little bit, but after she comes back at the end of her journey, um, as you may know from reading the posts, that she had gone on this trip because she was a reporter for the New York World. But when she comes back, she actually left the World because she thought that they did not treat her very well after she came back. Despite all she had done for them and the immense financial gains that they received, in the in the games and the contest and just all the extra readership from what she did, all this that was monetized for them, that they did not really give her a piece of that. And so she said, okay, well, I'll leave. And so I guess I can talk a little bit about what happened later in her life. So kind of continuing on that theme of her kind of forging her own path, women forging the way, right? That she actually went on to run her husband's company after he passed away, and she was also an inventor. She registered a patent, I believe, for a type of barrel or something like that. So she was very dynamic, and eventually she did actually get back into reporting. And there are wonderful pictures on the website. I forget actually which website. I'll have to look it up. But there are wonderful pictures of Nellie Bly on the Eastern Front in World War One. So in probably Galicia, I think, or possibly in Serbia, but somewhere out there. And at this point she was a little older, but she was still out there, still kind of pushing the envelope for what was considered, appropriate, I guess, and socially acceptable for women. And so she was a really dynamic character. And I think I learned certainly a lot about the expectations that kind of surrounded her and the ways that she pushed that.
So one of our, someone in the audience has asked, do you consider Nellie Bly a feminist? And she asked the question of all of the panelists, how do you feel about Nellie Bly, and do you consider her a feminist? So I'll ask you guys, and then I'll share my thoughts about it.
Yeah, I can talk first. I would. I think that, obviously she's a product of her time, but the fact that she was willing to, stand up, like Lawson was just saying, stand up for herself and for what she deserved after doing all of this work, and that the New York World wasn't going to give it to her. I think it says a lot about, her own self-confidence and her thought about, women in particular. And I think going into even the other stories that she wrote, her investigation into, insane asylums and her story about that and undercover work, I think says a lot about how she feels about women and as well, because if you know anything about, especially that time period when it comes to, the quote unquote madhouses, women could be locked up for any number of things that we would, completely laugh at today. Anything from, being too emotional to their husband just didn't want them anymore. And so the fact that she was willing to, put herself on the line to uncover a lot of the things that went on in those kind of places, I think also says a lot about that. I don't know if I would necessarily call her a feminist by today's definition of it, but I think that as a product of her time, she definitely did do a lot for women and for herself as a woman.
If I would agree with Sarah, I think that she would definitely qualify as a feminist, probably not like a third wave feminism. I guess if you want to get into like the sociology of it. But she definitely advocated for women, she advocated for herself, and she was a trailblazer and pushed the envelope in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I don't have a terrifically large amount to add to that. I think that sums it up pretty well, is that for her time, she was certainly very much kind of pushing the envelope of what was considered acceptable or even, normal. And that and she was very critical, I think, of a lot of the ways that sexism was expressed in the society at that time. So I would say absolutely yes, she was a feminist of that era.
I just add that I consider her very much a pioneer. And along with the number of the women who are addressing issues related to gender and equality of the time, some of the causes she writes about, that very first letter that she writes to the editor of the Dispatch, she lays out kind of her feelings about class and about working women and girls. And she head on addresses inequity in the workplace and issues related to access for women. So her whole journey is predicated on a conversation. She comes up with this idea. She's not the first to kind of recreate this Jules Verne journey around the world. She goes to her editor at the World and he says, "Why should I send you? You know, I can't send a woman by herself. You'll take too much luggage. Who's going to help you? I'll just send a man." And she basically, at least she says in her account, I said to him, "Send a man and I'll go to another paper and I'll start that same day on that journey and I'll beat him." So she had a real sense of herself, and she was assertive in some of these situations. You know, when her husband passed away, she did take over his business and she ran that business successfully in the beginning. And as Lawson said, you know, became even an inventor. So she succeeded in many spheres. And as Sarah and Nate both said, you know, she was a trailblazer. So is she a 20th century feminist in the way the term came to be used? No, but is she a pioneer and somebody who concerned herself with issues related to women and to opening doors, new doors for women? Definitely. We have just a couple more minutes. There was a question about some of the newspapers that she wrote for. Lawson, you've mentioned the Pittsburgh Dispatch, you mentioned New York World. Are there others of note that we should be mentioning that she wrote for?
Unfortunately, I don't know any of the other ones off the top of my head. Maybe you do. But she worked the Dispatch for maybe less than 2 years. It was from 1885 to March 1887. And a lot of that time she spent in Mexico, or, you know, a few months of that time she spent in Mexico making content for the Dispatch. But she wasn't there for a terribly long time. Yeah, and then she went to New York, and because she was kind of unhappy with the way that she was treated in the environment at the World, where she was kind of confined to these issues which were considered to be women's issues like gardening and stuff like that. But she went to the World. I don't know after that. I know that, I mean, after she left the World, I don't think she went straight to another newspaper because she was doing lecture tours and things of that nature for a good while after that. So I don't know do you know anything about that, Anne?
I don't know exactly, Nate. I don't know if Nate knows more, but something we can look into, and we can put it when we send out the follow-up information. We can send more information. There are some excellent biographies, and I think a couple of them have been mentioned in the chat of her life as well, if you're looking for more information. And there are even documentaries that have been made of her life. And I think at least one of them you can watch online. So there's some good information, contextual information out there for people who are looking for more information. Let me just finish by asking our panelists to talk about, do you have a favorite moment from Nellie that either something we've done a program on in the past, Nate? Sarah, I know we've done quizzes that have included her in the past. Lawson, you've delved so much into her life. A favorite moment from Nellie's life or from this project that you'd like to share with people? Or even something that you learned about her that was unexpected.
Yeah, like Anne just alluded to, we have, we have the opportunity, I think, with the History Center, like I said earlier, to talk about a lot of people out of Western Pennsylvania. And she's always one of those figures that comes up, especially when we're talking about women out of this area or other notable just any notable person from this area. So we've had a few online quizzes that have included her as one of the answers, which I think is always exciting to find out that you are the most like Nellie Bly compared to some of the other people. I think going back to something that Nate said earlier about Jules Verne, I've always been a science fiction fan as well. I've enjoyed Jules Verne's novels myself. And so I think that I didn't necessarily realize that when she did this journey around the world that she had the opportunity to sit down and meet Jules Verne during her trip. And so I know that was one of the stories that Lawson wrote about that just went up over the weekend on our landing page. And so that was a fun, surprising story for me to read. I guess I kind of always assumed that she, did it separately from him or from anything like that. And it was encouraging to see that she got the chance to meet him and talk about him, kind of at the offset of her journey before she started the whole thing in the 72 days that it took her.
I have two very small tidbits or stories that go along with Nellie's story. One of them is from her time in Mexico. So whenever I was researching for the script for the reenactor who portrays Nellie Bly in our Night at the History Museum overnighter program, I learned that Nellie Bly did not like Mexican food. I thought that was just a really funny anecdote. For spending so much time there, she didn't enjoy the food at all. But I also really like the story about the monkey that she got in Singapore. That always really connects with kids and families, and they always find that really interesting. That she went around the world and ended up with a pet that she had for a while, and that made a lot of the remainder of the trip that came along with her. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to the monkey after she got back to New York. Kind of got lost to history a little bit, but I think it's an interesting little anecdote.
Yeah, for me, I don't know that. Certainly, one of the parts of her story that stands out to me, just because it's kind of poignant in its own way, was when she was in Canton, or the Chinese city which is now called Guangzhou, and it was Christmas, and she actually spent Christmas, in Canton, and as she talks about in her writing, just kind of the feeling of sort of isolation, kind of and loneliness, and thinking of being so far away from home, but still kind of being connected in that. And so that kind of made me think of some ways, in our current global situation, a lot of us are at home or are dealing, especially as we come into the holidays here, dealing with kind of a different way of experiencing some of these holidays. And so I think that part of her story is especially poignant to think about this year and this time.
Lawson, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think I like Nellie when she shows us kind of that humanity, that sense of humanity, when she's less a reporter and journalist, and she lets us into her life and her experiences in that personal way. It has great relevance, I think, and that's what makes her someone we can connect to. Is she does have that side to her where she shows her, whether it's her bravado or her assertiveness or her she's not afraid to share her opinions and how she feels about things. And I think that makes her very human and very approachable as a character from the past. I know we're almost out of time, and we appreciate everybody sticking with us. I just wanted to finish up by thanking Lawson for doing an incredible job with this project and kind of bringing this great story to everyone. And also invite Nate. I know we have some upcoming programs as this project rolls out through January, and we finish out Nellie's journey around the world with her. There's going to be a number of other upcoming opportunities.
Yeah. So right now on the Nellie Bly landing page on the History Center website, we have a couple of different things. There are a couple of DIY activities for kids and families. So the first one that we have up right now is about building a suitcase similar to the one that Nellie Bly took on her journey around the world. And we'll be adding in more activities throughout this journey. And the two programs that we've been working on, one is going to be connected with the Western Pennsylvania writing project out of the University of Pittsburgh. So we'll be doing a family gallery broadcast that talks about Nellie and some of the writing that she did, and showing off the History Center's copy of the board game related to Nellie's story. And on January 24th, we're going to be doing a family book club based on Jules Verne Around the World in 80 Days. And so families will read the story before then, and we'll talk about it and make the connections to Nellie's story, and think about how the world has changed since then. So we have a lot of things coming up related to Nellie, and we might be able to add one or two more programs as well. So just keep your eyes on the History Center events page for any updates on that front.
Thanks, Nate. And as we build out the page, as we finish out the program here today, there's lots of real richness of information that Lawson and others have gathered. So do continue to check back with Nellie. Follow us, whether it's on the website at the Nellie Bly page, or whether it's through one of the social media platforms, especially Twitter, where Sarah's sharing out these little tidbits of information as Nellie goes around the globe. We hope you'll journey along through the end of January with us and continue to discover the world of Nellie Bly and chart her adventures with us. So thank you for coming today.